This episode of Literary Treks is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 150,000 titles for your desktop or mobile device. To get a free audiobook of your choice, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. Also, help us keep Star Trek discussion coming to you each day by becoming a Trek FM patron through Patreon. Get access to exclusive content and become part of the team. You'll find all the details at patreon.com/trekfm. That's patreon.com/trekfm.
Hey everyone, I'm Rod Roddenberry, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Are you taking all these books? I thought I'd take some light reading, in case I got bored.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Literary Treks. This is your official Star Trek book and comic show here on Trek FM. And I'm Bruce Gibson, one of your hosts, but it takes two to tango in the literary world, so he's with me, as he always is, doing the tango, Dan Gunther.
Oh my. Yes, I am here. Tangoing apparently. How are you doing, Bruce?
Well, since it does take two to tango, I'd rather tango with you, Dan, than anyone else here at Trek FM.
I'm very flattered. Thank you for saying so. I agree with I agree with that sentiment completely.
Because I know when we tango, we would be reading Star Trek books at the same time.
It's tricky, but it is possible. Absolutely.
We have a new cover to review.
Excellent.
Should we sing about that? We have a cover.
I don't know. We're judging a book, but no. It's not the same without Matt. I'm sorry.
I know. You're right. We will judge the book without singing. So the book cover is Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Original Sin by David R. George III.
And also with the subtitle Gamma, which is interesting.
Gamma. That is very interesting to me. So Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Gamma. Now that tells me that we're getting a series of books called Gamma.
It's possible. I mean, there could be more coming up in kind of like a mini series or a sub-series of Deep Space Nine. Because this book has to do, and we'll get to the blurb in a second, it has to do with the voyages of the USS Robinson under the command of Captain Sisko exploring the Gamma Quadrant. So, yeah, wouldn't that be cool to get kind of a little mini series of books dealing with that extended mission?
I think that might be the plan. We haven't officially heard anything about it. I haven't really heard talk about the Gamma subtitle from really anybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it kind of
just
popped up with this cover. I hadn't heard that would be the case until we saw the cover.
Right. And the cover, speaking of, has a Galaxy-class ship, which is the Robinson, and it's kind of, I guess, on its side, like it's moving vertically down on the cover. And it looks like it's being worked on. There's like some maybe little repair shuttle pods of some type around it. Is that what it looks like to you? Or maybe it's being invaded by something.
Yeah, I'm wondering if they're maybe little alien objects of some kind. Because if you look, the ship is totally powered down, right? None of the lights are on. The warp engines are down. The deflector dish isn't glowing. And also something that makes the cover look really plain, but I'm wondering if there's a reason for this. There's no stars or any kind of spacescape in the background. It looks like they're kind of in this black void. So I'm kind of wondering what's going on there.
I think we need to read the blurb because I think it's going to highlight exactly what we're looking at here.
At the end of 2385, in a significant shift of its goals from military back to exploratory, Starfleet sent Captain Benjamin Sisko and the crew of the USS Robinson on an extended mission into the Gamma Quadrant. Tasked with a years-long assignment to travel unknown regions, they set out to fulfill the heart of Starfleet's charter, to explore strange new worlds, and to seek out new life and new civilizations. But now, 3 months into the mission, their first contact with an alien species comes in the form of an unprovoked attack on the Robinson. With the ship's crew suddenly incapacitated, 78 of the 1,300 aboard are abducted, including Sisko's daughter, Rebecca. But Rebecca had already been kidnapped years earlier by a Bajoran religious zealot, part of a sect believing that her birth fulfilled the prophecy of the arrival of the infant Avatar. Does her disappearance now have anything to do with the harrowing events of the past? And for what purposes have these enemies taken Sisko's daughter and the rest of the missing?
So it is under attack.
It does seem that way.
And 1,300 crewmen are abducted. We know this is a Galaxy-class ship with 1,300 crew people that are now missing. So he's got a full big crew on this ship.
And 78 of them have been abducted, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, yes, that's right. 78 of the 1,300. So this is interesting. I was hoping we would get a USS Robinson book with Captain Sisko on it because we knew that he'd been assigned to this starship. And I was just curious to see how a book would play out, having Sisko as a captain of a starship. I don't know if that's been my lifelong dream to see Sisko commanding a ship. I always liked seeing him on the space station in Deep Space Nine and being with the crew there. But I am curious to see how this plays out and introduce ourselves to a new crew that he has to deal with. And we've seen some of this in some previous books, but not a book just dedicated to it. So, Dan, do you think, is this something that you've been wanting to see? Or is this something like, I don't know, I could care less. Just bring Sisko back to the station.
I am curious to see how this plays out. I think, putting characters in different situations is always interesting. And of course, Sisko was his most badass when he was in command of the Defiant. So, it's a different type of ship, though. I'm assuming if it's like Galaxy-class ships of the past, there'll be a lot of civilians on board, civilian scientists, and possibly even families. So to see Sisko in that role as, ahead of that kind of community, not sitting in one place and dealing with those issues, but traveling through space and, seeking out new life and new civilizations, it could be really interesting to kind of see where that story takes him.
I'd like to see maybe a couple books, 2 or 3 books like this, but then have him come back to the station. He could still be on the Robinson, but have him back at Deep Space Nine in some kind of interaction or role of some sort. But I am curious to see, 1, him being captain of a starship, and 2, I've been wanting to see more exploration of the Gamma Quadrant. So that's what I'm really excited about too. So it should be interesting. I'm just trying to picture him on a bridge that looks like the lobby of a Marriott.
Exactly.
That's hard. It's hard to imagine.
It's a little tough, Deep Space Nine tonally has always been a little darker, a little bit more, I don't want to say realistic because that feels like I'm demeaning the next generation, but, it's always had that kind of darker edge to it. And even just physically, the station and those spaces had kind of a darker look to them, a more lived in feel. So it is kind of weird mentally to put Sisko on the bridge of the Enterprise D or a ship that's, a sister ship of the Enterprise D. It's it's a different look for sure.
And I just wonder if he has his baseball with him.
Oh, he's got it.
They're in his ready room.
Card had a fish, Sisko's got his baseball.
There you go. Well, this book comes out on September 26th of this year, 2017, and it's 384 pages, and it'll be out in paperback and in ebook. So whatever your format preference is, it's available. So get that book when it comes out. Pre-order today, because I've seen it's on Amazon and other sites, so check it out. Our next news item, we have 2 new Kelvin Timeline books. Now, don't get excited, everyone. These aren't novels. I know we haven't had Kelvin Timeline novels yet, but those still aren't coming. These are art books, which is just as exciting. So they're coming out this fall from Titan Books, and the first one is called Star Trek Beyond, The Makeup Artistry of Joel Harlow. Now, Joe Harlow is the guy that did a lot of the, I'll just read it right here. It features pencil sketches, stunning concept art, and beautiful photography. This is a visually arresting book that gives fans a unique, in-depth look into the remarkable work that went into this immensely popular movie. So on the cover, we see one of the aliens. If you remember, Star Trek Beyond came out on the 50th anniversary and featured 50 new aliens, and we see one of the aliens on the cover. So I guess we're going to see all the different makeup that he did for these 50 aliens and maybe even more. I don't know what else, there may be other, just our regular crew seeing the makeup job that he did on them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this looks really cool. And, we should definitely add Academy Award nominated makeup work for Star Trek Beyond. Did not win, unfortunately. I think it should have.
Yeah, Suicide Squad,
yeah,
right?
I mean, like if you just look at the
won.
cover of this book and the alien woman that it shows is, if you remember Star Trek Beyond, at the end, Chekhov was kind of making a play on this alien woman, and this is her. And just this incredible, gorgeous headpiece she's got and full body makeup kind of thing. Just incredible work that, I mean, I'm not a Hollywood insider. I don't know exactly what the Academy looks for and all that kind of stuff. But man, the makeup work on that movie, I think it should have won personally. But, regardless, we get a look at all of the incredible work that went into making these fantastic alien creations.
Well, and the movie goes so fast when we're on the Yorktown and we're seeing all these different aliens in the background. A lot of them you're not getting a real close-up look at. This book would actually give us the opportunity to get a close-up look. I don't know if every alien is featured in here, all 50. It doesn't mention that, but I'm assuming that we'll see a majority of, if not all of his work that he did for the film. And so I think it would really be fun, too. And I don't think this would be in the book, but it would be really interesting if we were given names of all the aliens and where they're from and some of their background. There is an author to this book named Joe Nazaro. But again, I think it's just going to be talking more about the makeup and not, and this alien is from this planet and they came to the Alpha Quadrant 5,000 years ago. I mean, I don't think we're going to get any background of this species, but it is a 256-page hardcover coming out 2 days. Now, wait, let me see if I get this right, Dan. I know it comes out 2 days before my birthday, but I think it comes out 2 days after yours.
You are absolutely correct. Yep. So, if someone were to buy me this book for my birthday, it would have to be a late birthday gift, but, is a really good idea if you're shopping for Bruce Gibson. You could get him a gift on time. And if you make it this book, it would be a really cool gift too. So
I'm going to tell you honestly, nobody get me this book because it comes out October 3rd. My birthday's October 5th. It seems like every time a book is coming out, it always comes out the week after my birthday. Because my wife always says to me, are there any books coming out that you want? I'm like, yeah, but it's not coming out until the 11th or what. It's always a week or so later. And I never feel like there's a book that's coming. And then any book that comes out before that, like a week or two, I'm already buying. I'm not going to wait 2 weeks,
Yeah.
So this is one that I'm going to say, yeah, for my birthday, this one. It comes out 2 days before. So definitely. So this is one to check out. Another book that's coming out is The Art of Star Trek, The Kelvin Timeline. And this covers the creation of Star Trek 09, Into Darkness, and beyond. So this is all the never before seen concept art and design that went into these films. And it also includes interviews with key creatives who helped bring these exciting movies to life on the big screen. This comes out November 7th. Author is Jeff Bond, and I'm really excited about this too because it's not just about the makeup. This is all the different art and design that went into all three movies, and it really is exciting to me.
Yeah, as one of those Star Trek fans that loves the intricate details behind, prop design and costume design and ships and all that stuff, like this behind the scenes stuff is always really, really exciting to me. And yeah, this looks like a really cool book, and it's really great to be getting some of that behind the scenes stuff that I feel like we haven't really seen a lot of lately. There was always kind of behind the scenes of Star Trek First Contact and all those kind of things that you saw popping up all the time. But lately, yeah, it seems there's been a little bit of a drought of that stuff. So to finally kind of get this, that's pretty cool. I'm looking forward to it.
I would like Bad Robot to do a book that is an encyclopedia of the Kelvin timeline. And it's kind of like an in-universe thing, like the Okudas did for all of Star Trek. And I know they included Into Darkness and 09 in theirs. But, I mean, one encyclopedia where there's like so much in-universe information. And I want behind-the-scenes stuff, too. But I would like something in-universe, too, that maybe gives us more background on things that we didn't get in the movies that maybe they had in mind when they were making the movies. Like, oh, well, this is kind of the background of what Sulu was doing before the first movie and what Chekhov and so on. So, that I would love to read sometime. But that's not what's coming out right now. So dreams are one thing. I'm very happy with these two books. So, again, real quick, Star Trek Beyond, The Makeup Artistry of Joel Harlow comes out October 3rd, and then a month later, November 7th, we get The Art of Star Trek, The Kelvin Timeline.
Very cool. Definitely looking forward to seeing those on the shelf.
Well, you know what else you'll see on the shelf this year? You will see coloring books from Dark Horse, and these are Star Trek coloring books. So last December, they had 2 volumes of coloring books, one for the original series and one for the Next Generation, and those proved to be very successful. So that was in 2016. So for this year in 2017, Dark Horse has announced that they're doing 2 more volumes, an original series volume 2 called Where No Man Has Gone Before, and a Next Generation volume 2 called Continuing Missions. And I've never bought an adult coloring book, but I put an example in our notes here for us to look at of one of the first volumes. And I mean, it's really taking scenes from the original series with a lot of detail, and I can see that it would take a lot of time to color in these pages.
Yeah, like you, I've never bought an adult coloring book. I've never, done that sort of thing. But looking at these sample pages here, and every time I see one of these and kind of flip through it, the Star Trek ones, I kind of have this weird desire to just like sit down with pencil crayons and color it all because it's gorgeous. It looks like it would be a lot of fun. And I do have to admit, every time I see them in the store, I am briefly tempted to pick them up. But, I don't have enough time to do the stuff that I already do. I couldn't fit coloring in. But, for those out there who enjoy adult coloring books, these look incredible. Like the level of detail is just gorgeous. I think these would be a lot of fun if you're into that.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think this is something that if you're a Star Trek fan and you like to color, but yeah, I mean, if you ever get these and you color them, share some of your artwork in the Babel conference on Facebook with everyone so we can all see them. I think it would be great.
Absolutely. Anybody who picked up last year's as well, if you have any lying around that you've done some coloring in, we'd love to see that. That'd be great. That's a great idea. I'd love to see that.
Well, and when they make comic books, it's the same thing. Someone draws the art and then someone colors it in. You have your penciler and you have your color artist, which leads me into the fact we have 2 comic books to review today.
Wow, you were getting really good at the segues.
I've learned from Mark Herlerman at Star Wars Report. He does this stuff all the time with me. So our first comic book that came out recently is Star Trek New Visions number 16, Time Out of Joint. And that's time, space, out of joint. It's not time out as one word. So time out of joint, which really kind of threw me for a loop. I was like, I hope this has nothing to do with like illegal drugs or anything. Because I was like, okay,
yeah,
whatever.
I think you're the only one who went there.
So anyway, we've got this cover that features a weird alien up in one corner, and we see Finnegan from the episode Shore Leave, and we see Rand, and she's wearing a blue uniform, and Spock's in fire, and there's McCoy, and Kirk just looks all distressed. It looks like this book's going to have a lot going on, because even the Enterprise looks like it's getting destroyed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this one, I have to say, I think, thinking back through the New Vision comics, I think this is probably the first one where I can say, after having read it, I really liked that. I really enjoyed the story. I thought it was really good. It still has a lot of the drawbacks that I think this whole series has. For example, when there's new aliens or new strange settings, it looks off and it looks a little bit cartoony and weird. But there's not a lot of that in this one until you get towards the end. And the story itself, like I found myself flipping through wanting to know what was happening next. And I love the kind of... So what's happening is the Enterprise is under attack and we kind of don't really know a lot about what's going on. And Kirk is in an accident in engineering and then begins kind of randomly jumping through time, forward and back to the middle of the battle, to days before the battle, to, even months earlier on a totally different mission, and even back to the Academy. And it's a really interesting story. At least the first 2/3 really had my attention. I think it, for me, lost a little bit towards the end. It got a little bit like, oh, okay, now I guess we got to wrap it up. But that's kind of a little bit par for the course with weird Star Trek premises, if that makes sense.
I'm kind of right there with you. And just for some listeners who aren't that familiar with New Visions, just to remind you, or if you didn't know, this comic isn't done in traditional comic style of art, drawing and coloring like we were talking about earlier. These are actual photos from the series that are manipulated to look like new scenes from the series. Like they just pulled the film out and put it into a comic book. So it's a photo novel in a sense, a photo comic. But you're right. When the story was going on and Kirk's experiencing all of these different time changes, all of a sudden he walks through a door and he's slightly in the future. Then he walks through another door and he's slightly in the past, and he's kind of going through all that. I was a little interested. I was getting more interested in it, and the reading started to go faster and faster for me because I knew what was going on, and I just wanted to see where he was going to next. And as we saw Finnegan on the cover, we see Finnegan in here who he fought with and got picked on and bullied on with from the Academy, Starfleet Academy back in the day. So we see that. So then we see his former flame Janet from the Deadly Years in another scene, showing where they were in the past, back in the days before he had the Enterprise, which is kind of funny. She's like, Jim, I really need to talk to you about something important. He goes, I don't have time for this. I got to go. He goes through a door, because every time he went through a door, he would jump through time. And this time it wasn't working, which I thought was kind of funny.
Yeah, that was pretty funny. The one thing that scene in particular made me think of was, like, when Kirk time jumps to these different times, is what he does permanently affecting the timeline going forward and that kind of thing? And it's something the story doesn't really address. Like, does the quantum leaping Kirk, for lack of a better term, is that really how that interaction with Janice went way back when now? Or did that not, is it like All Good Things, where once it's all resolved, that's not what actually happened, and history as we know it is normal? Or did it make such a little effect that it doesn't really matter? That's just kind of the nerd brain in me going like, ooh, but what about,
Well, because in the first part of the book, when he would walk through a door, it seemed to be that if he was going to the bridge and he walked on the bridge, he was in a different time on the bridge. Mm-hmm. And then if he left the bridge and got in the turbo lift and then went to sickbay, all of a sudden he's entered a different time in sickbay. So it seemed that physically he was staying in the same places, but just in different times. Then all of a sudden we see, well, now he's not even just changing time, he's changing locations.
Mm-hmm. There did seem to be kind of an escalation as it went on.
Yeah, and you're right. It's like, was he going into these different times and affecting them in any way? Or I'm going to assume when we get to the end of the book that what was going on got wiped out of the timeline. Mm-hmm. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we need Christopher Bennett on to talk about, the Department of Temporal Investigations and how they classify various temporal incursions. But I think, yeah, you're right. This is probably one of those times that they eliminated the original cause of the time travel, so everything reset is my guess.
I guess. I don't know. And then the other thing I only had an issue with was about the whole idea of moving this planet. I didn't really. I kind of got why, but I thought it seemed a little weak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was an odd solution to the problem. And then it also made me think, like, if you can dig a hole that deep with phasers and plant explosions and blow something up big enough to move a small planet, why the heck did they have such a hard time moving asteroids in, the episode, for example, like the Paradise Syndrome, where they had a few months for that asteroid to deflect it? Why couldn't they have just done this? It seems like it would have been less mass. I don't know.
I have an answer to that. I actually have two theories on that. One, because in this comic, Kirk is jumping the timeline, so he was able to go into the phaser banks and redo them differently with a future technology he saw in a future time. I don't know. Or this story takes place years after the episode that you're talking about, and maybe they've developed better phaser technology on their own. So anyway, that's the comic. I enjoyed it though. I mean, yeah, there was little things like that. And I don't know, but overall, I enjoyed it.
Yeah, definitely. One thing I do want to comment on that I thought was a fun part was Kirk realizes he's in the future at one point because he sees Janice Rand aboard the ship in a blue science uniform, and she hadn't returned to the ship yet. So I thought that was pretty cool that was, how he was able to figure out he was in the future. What I was thinking as I was reading the comic, and I thought maybe they would do that, John Byrne would do this, but he didn't, would be to have Kirk appear and like everyone around him is wearing the Monster Maroon uniforms from the movies or something like that. He'd be like, what is going on? Scotty, you look so old. What's with the mustache? Like I thought that would have been kind of cool, but I don't know. They didn't go there. Oh, well, but
that would have been cool. I wonder if they even have the rights to use any of the images from the movies.
I don't know. I would assume so. IDW should, I would think. But yeah, in this format, I'm not sure. That's a good question.
Well, let's move on because we have yet another comic. Yes, indeed. So we have Star Trek Boldly Go #9, and this takes place in the Kelvin Timeline. And I'm going to say right off the bat that I really enjoyed this one. What about you, Dan?
Yeah, I really liked it too. There was a lot about it that was very charming. I really liked the interactions between Spock and Uhura as they kind of try to decipher Sarek's cryptic hints that maybe they should get married. Maybe? I don't know. But
it definitely brought up the topic for them to discuss. Should we or should we not get married?
Yeah.
So, I mean, who would ever thought that Star Trek fans like us would be talking about Star Trek, Spock, and Uhura wanting to get married?
And one of the covers for this issue is very obviously, like that's where my mind went immediately, was it looked like Spock and Uhura as a bride and groom with, Spock's family surrounding him kind of thing. And I thought, oh, do they? And then I realized, no, they're not going to marry Spock and Uhura in a comic. But, for a second, I kind of thought, hey, are they getting married in this? And then, okay, no, never mind. That they won't do that. But they definitely talk about it. And, it's on their minds for sure.
Yeah, it's not written off as something that's not a possibility. We could see them get married. It doesn't conclude with this will never happen. There's no way I'm going to marry you. But it is funny the exchanges that they're having. And also at the same time, it's exploring what's going on New Vulcan, which I'm also finding very interesting. And I'd like to see more stories like this because now that their planet was destroyed in Star Trek 09 by Nero, and they're starting all over again on New Vulcan, I'd love to see all the things that they have to go through as a society to keep themselves together and to establish new colonies on the planet and discover new things about the planet that they have to deal with, and also just getting Vulcan back to being Vulcan again with what few people they have left. and then Uhura's there, and she's going to help work at the Science Academy and teach Earth history to the children there. And so we see some of that. So that's a unique perspective to see her doing something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really, I love this because it feels more like a character piece than most of the comics we get. You know, there's not a lot of action. There's kind of this mystery that has to be solved, but it's not, you know, there's nobody's firing phasers and there's no space battles or anything like that. It's a more of a quiet story. And the main story that I really like, and I'm not going to give away everything, but the main story made me think a lot about, you know, there's debates in the scientific community for example, if we're burying nuclear waste from nuclear reactors or something like that, how will you communicate to future civilizations, you know, possibly tens of thousands of years in the future, that, you know, don't go digging this stuff up, don't go looking for this, it's too dangerous. And the main story focuses on that, putting the people of New Vulcan in the role of that future civilization that might possibly dig something up that they shouldn't. And it's really interesting the way that this long dead civilization kind of communicates that forward. It's a cool story, and I think it's definitely well worth a read. It'll make you think.
Well, and that's what Star Trek does best, is make us think, right?
Exactly.
And so if we get a Star Trek story making us thinking, then it's a good one. So I put the stamp of approval on this one.
Hear, hear. Me too.
So recently on Literary Treks, we have been reviewing the first original novels of each of the Star Trek series. And on today's feature, we're going to review the first original novel of The Next Generation. And this is a novel by Diane Carey, who's written plenty of novels back in the day. And this one came out in 1988 and is called Ghost Ship. So this came out towards the tail end of the first season of The Next Generation. As a matter of fact, it looks like the printing happened on July 1988. So the first season had just ended, which means that she was writing it during the first season. So I'm sure she hadn't seen the last few episodes of the first season when she was writing this. So it's interesting to go into early books when we know so much about the characters after 7 seasons and movies and other novels, to go back to an early novel and see what did the author pick up on at the time that still holds true today as the series developed, and what things maybe are a little different that don't kind of sit well with what we know of the Next Generation and its characters. But before we get really deep into that, Dan, when was the first time you read Ghost Ship? And this is the number 1. This is when they numbered the books. It's number 1. Because there was Encounter at Farpoint. Mm-hmm. There was a novelization of that, but they didn't number it. But this was numbered 1 in those series.
Right. Well, the first time I read this book was actually last week. I have not read this book before. This is the first time I have ever read it. I've heard a lot about it over the years, but I've never actually sat down to read it until now.
Wow.
Indeed.
I'm impressed. So, and you have an actual hard copy. Is it a used book that you bought recently, or have you had it for a long period of time?
It is a used book. I bought it at a used bookstore. I'm not sure exactly when. It was quite some time ago, but it's just kind of been on my shelf, and I've never gotten around to it. So, yeah, I didn't buy this book. I do, according to the copyright page, I do have a first printing copy of this book, which is kind of cool. But I definitely did not buy it at the time in 1988. I bought it at a used bookstore sometime in the last 5 or 6 years.
Well, and your book is a little unusual, because we were talking before the show on the other side of the page that it shows on the cover that yours was printed in Canada.
Yeah, it has a little maple leaf in the corner, and it says published in Canada. And inside it says printed in Canada by... in Canada, distributed by Paperjacks Limited in Markham, Ontario. So I'm wondering if they had, Pocket Books had a Canadian subsidiary that they printed other print runs of books out for Canadian audiences. It's kind of cool.
Yeah, because you never seen that on a cover of a Star Trek book before.
No, and I'm actually going to have to look through my collection a little more closely now to see if that's anywhere else, if this is the only one I have that's like that.
Well, mine is printed in the USA. That's what it says in the inside cover, and I have the 6th edition, number 6. So I did not get an original, and mine is not a used book. I bought this new.
Oh, wow.
And this is one of the early books that I read of Star Trek The Next Generation back when I started reading Star Trek books, which was in 1990. So it was around July, August. It was in the summer of 90 that I started reading Star Trek books. And I was trying to remember at what point did I read this one? I knew it had to be early on. So I'm looking on the back cover and there's a price tag on it. And it's from Kmart.
Oh.
So I know I bought it at Kmart. And it does have a date on it, and it's September 1992.
Very cool.
So I read this, that makes it, 25 years ago?
Wow. That's crazy to think about. Wow, we're getting old.
25 years ago, read this book, and 25 years later, I read it again.
25 years ago. Do you realize that you read that book half of a history of Star Trek ago?
That's true. We should be having a 25th anniversary party for this book.
That's pretty cool. Excellent.
But when reading it this time, I didn't really remember much of this at all.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't like I was like, oh yeah, I remember this, and oh yeah, I was just like, it was like the first time reading it. I have no memories of the first time I read it. Having read over 300 Star Trek books, a lot of this is a blur.
Wow.
You know?
So yeah, our experience reading it this time, we both read physical copies, which is kind of cool. You know, it's nice. So many books I read nowadays tend to be ebooks that it's really nice to kind of sit down with a physical copy and you know, read the words, flip the pages kind of thing. It's a neat experience.
Yeah, and I like using bookmarkers again. Like I have these bookmarkers that John Jackson Miller gave me a few months ago, and so I've been using them, which is pretty cool too.
I'm bad. I have a movie stub from Logan as my bookmark. It was whatever was on my nightstand at the time. Well, we should talk a little bit about the plot of this story. It's definitely a different one. So we'll talk in a little bit for sure about the differences in the characters from The Next Generation, which some people say means that it takes place in an alternate universe where the characters are slightly different. But not only that, it takes place in an alternate universe where the Soviet Union did not fall in 1991. Because in 1995, the crew of a Soviet aircraft carrier, somehow, is absorbed into a life form that imprisons them in a sort of dissociative mental state, and they're all kind of floating in there as ghosts, disembodied people kind of thing. And so hundreds of years later, this form threatens the crew of the Enterprise with the same fate. And Picard, of course, must lead the crew out of danger. And in the end, he kind of faces a tough choice. Should he leave the victims of this thing to their fate, or put them out of their misery by essentially destroying this thing and killing them? So what did you kind of think of kind of the basic story of this as a Star Trek adventure?
The basic premise, the basic story feels like a Star Trek adventure because you are dealing with a creature that is an unknown and trying to figure things out. You're dealing with history and trying to relate this creature to what happened in history and the beings that are trapped inside, which we'll go into much more detail later about that. But I think overall, I like the concept. It felt very, quote, alien to me, which I like. So, and seeing the crew trying to figure things out, is this an intelligent being? Is it just, they were relating it to how animals think or how insects work? So they brought a lot of dialogue from the crew to try to figure out what this creature is and how to deal with it. So I did like that. What did you think, Dan?
I like you, I think it's a very it felt very Star Trek. You know, there's kind of the moral quandaries, the ethical stuff. And yeah, it's this strange alien form that the crew doesn't quite know what to make of. And, you know, you get the stuff with Deanna Troi and the telepathic / empathic stuff that she's dealing with, and Data's kind of journey in this was really interesting. I think it works. Like, the basic premise, it's interesting, and it's a good hook to kind of introduce you to this new crew early on.
Well, and you made the point too about the Soviet ship missing in 1995. And of course, the Soviet Union wasn't around anymore in 95. It was more like 1990, 91 that it dissolved. It would be interesting to go and look at the ebook. I don't think they would have corrected the date, but if they didn't, I think they should just move it back, 5 years or something, or, And it's interesting that she would have chosen for this event to happen in 95 when she wrote the book in 88. I mean, it could easily have taken place in the year she was writing this book. It could have been in the late 80s. There's no reason why it had to happen. The missing of this crew happened in the mid 90s.
Well, I think what it was they were testing that new weapon kind of thing, and I think it was futuristic enough that Diane Carey probably wanted to put it out a few years kind of thing. What's interesting to me is that in 87, 88, when she was writing this book, there was no warning that the Soviet Union would fall within a few years. That to me is always really interesting with regards to the history of the Cold War and stuff. When the Berlin Wall fell in 89, it was kind of a surprise, like, oh, and then how quickly the country itself dissolved within 2 years after that was, really unexpected by a lot of people. So it's really cool that there's this little tiny slice of history right here where, you could have gone either way just a few years and it would have totally been different. But because of the year it was written in, we get this view of the world that, like, oh, the Soviet Union, yeah, it's still going to be around for a while kind of thing.
Well, maybe it's not the Soviet Union that we know of. Maybe it's the remnants of some renegade Soviet people or whatever that are even working with Khan in the eugenic wars at this time and developing new weapons.
It could be. It's only 1 year before Khan leaves Earth. But yeah, I think in the Star Trek universe, which unfortunately at this point I just have to admit is not the universe we're living in, darn it. Although, we'd be in the middle of probably some pretty bad wars right now if it was, I guess. It's different from our history, I guess. Star Trek 4, Leningrad still exists, so maybe the Soviet Union just never fell in Star Trek history.
Oh, this is happening in the timeline where Edith Keeler didn't die. That's what's going on here.
Oh, man. We're just warping this book totally out of history.
We are digging into one chapter, one paragraph way too deeply.
I think that's it, yeah.
We must be Star Trek nerds.
What? No, we wouldn't overanalyze something like crazy, would we?
Never. Well, speaking of overanalyze, I really want to overanalyze the characters in this book so bad. And you know what, Dan? You put in the notes just a list of our crew members. I started writing detailed notes for each one of them. I was like, this is going to be a lot of notes to put in here. I thought, you know what? When you just listed them, I'm like, yeah, we just need to just talk through it. I'm not writing all this down. So let's talk about this. Again, this is an early book. Now, we've done early first original novels of some of the other series. We've done Voyager, we've done Deep Space Nine, we've even done the original pocketbook novel for the original series. And I would say the characters have been spot on.
Mm-hmm.
For the most part, those books fit in really well. They stand well today. They would work well today, going back and reading that and saying, hey, this takes place in the first year of the series. This works. This one, I think it still works. It works as a first season book. And I guess I'll get into that more as we're going into the characters, but just overall, Dan, does it work for you or does it feel off?
Well, it's definitely off, I think. That's not to say it doesn't necessarily work, but it definitely is a very different version of this crew than what we know. I would say even in season 1 of The Next Generation. Now, the story I've always heard about this book is that when Diane Carey was writing it, she only had access to the script from Encounter at Farpoint and the character descriptions from the show Bible. Now, I know it was published in 88, presumably right after the first season had aired, but I'm wondering if maybe she had written it earlier and it was held for publication for some reason or something like that. Or maybe the story that I heard that's all she had access to is completely wrong. I don't really have any, first person sources on that. So I'm not sure. That's what I've always heard, is that she hadn't actually seen anything of the show. It was just working from the script and the character descriptions in the show Bible. And if you ever read bits from the show Bible from The Next Generation before they actually started making the show, this book fits a lot of those characters. So, for example, Riker, part of his character was going to be his prejudice against Data and his not believing that he was a true life form, and that would change over the course of, the season or the series or whatever. But
so wait, they were going to make Riker into Dr. Pulaski?
Exactly. And as we know, Pulaski is basically Dr. McCoy. The reason this is going off into a tangent, but I think what they wanted to do was set it up like a Kirk, Spock, McCoy relationship, with Data and Riker being the Spock and McCoy. Again, I have no proof that that's what they were thinking, but just, that's kind of what I was thinking that maybe they were going for. The problem with that is Spock can be witty and have a comeback that's devastating, and they can truly match wits. Whereas Data is such an innocent life form, with not a lot of experience in that area, that it just feels like someone's just being mean to him and he's being whipped and he's like, oh, okay. And that's sad. That's not fun. So I feel like that's, again, this is me going way out on a limb with no support whatsoever, but I feel like that's probably why that idea was abandoned, and why a lot of that stuff with Pulaski, as much as I'm with Brandon, I actually really like the character of Pulaski, but I think that her ragging on Data really didn't work. And I think it's for that reason that Data was so, played such the straight man and wasn't able to have those witty barbs and comebacks like Spock would, and really kind of smack McCoy down. Data wouldn't really smack someone down kind of thing. He would just respond very earnestly. So that's just kind of my opinion there.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that piece that you were saying, the original idea with Riker as being one who's prejudiced with Data. And that definitely is reflected in this novel. I felt a little uncomfortable with the characters,
Mm-hmm.
but at the same time, they did feel like where the characters were in the first few episodes.
Mm-hmm.
Because I remember watching The Next Generation for the first time, and those first few episodes of the season were, I just thought, man, Picard is like really just pissed at everybody. He's kind of a hard jerk. He's just kind of like, oh, get out of my way. Oh, are you sure about that? Don't question me. And he was very much like that in this book. And that's the first character we'll talk about is Picard.
Mm.
I felt like he's just constantly rolling his eyes, every time, Dr. Crusher, tell me about what's going on. Well, this is going, just get to the point. It's like, I'm having a bad day. I haven't had my coffee.
Yeah, some of that stuff, like, it almost feels like those characteristics, but taken to just slightly too far, a little bit of an extreme. So, for example, Tasha Yar would be giving a report or something and saying like, oh, wait, it's disappeared, Captain. And Picard would think something like, oh, she doesn't know how to work that thing. Like, well, come on, like, what's wrong with you? Blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, would that really be your first? I mean, like, as strict as Picard was and as hard as he was, I don't feel like he automatically assumed incompetence on the part of people around him. And there were a few moments in this that I was like, oh, really? Like, I feel like Picard is a really good leader. And yeah, in those first episodes, he's a little strict, a little harsh, but I never thought of him as that jerk boss that you just hate. And a couple times he really came across as that in this.
There were times I was reading those lines and trying to make it sound softer, make it, have him just be a little more, forgiving. He's kind of being a little hard, but he's almost like a mentor. I'm just trying to push you in the right direction. But at the same time, I thought, well, let's take this as fact. Let's say that this novel is truly canon and this is what happened. I kept placing this novel very early into the series, as maybe it's just, this is occurring immediately after Encounter at Farpoint, or even after the second episode. And I thought maybe he's at a place where he's got a new crew, a new ship, and for some reason in the past, maybe on the Stargazer or something else in between, he kind of has trust issues, and it's something he has to overcome. Because, again, in the book, and as we saw in the series, he wasn't comfortable with having families, and he wasn't comfortable around children. And of course, as time goes on, that starts to change. And even into the novels, he has a child with Beverly, and so we've seen a lot of change in Picard over time. So I like to think that he's approaching this as, I've got this new crew. I've got to kind of snap them into place. I got to show them that I'm in charge. I need them to get to the point. There's a certain standard that I expect from them. So I'm going to be really hard here in the beginning until I get them to where I want them to be. And once we get there, then it's kind of smooth sailing and I can start to back up, I don't, and maybe that's even the parent in me, it's like, raising my children. I felt like when they were younger, I almost had to be a little harder about things with them. Now, don't touch that. Put that down. No, come over here. And now it's not like that.
No, Worf, don't put that in your mouth.
That's an actual line in the book now. What do you think? Does that work for you, or do you just, I don't know? Maybe I'm trying to be too forgiving.
No, it makes sense. But yeah, I feel like I had that same experience while I was reading it. I was kind of trying to round off the harsher edges a little bit and say, well, maybe he actually said this. But no, if you take what's in the book as face value, like, he's pretty strict and pretty harsh at times. And one thing I actually highlighted, which I found really funny, is I've never read Diane Carey's novelization of Broken Bow, but there are a lot of stories out there that about how critical she is of Enterprise. Clearly did not like the script or the show or the characters. And I was wondering if a little bit of that attitude was kind of peeking through in this book as well. There's just one part in particular that I thought was hilarious, where Picard is thinking about Wesley Crusher. And he says to himself something along the lines of, why on earth did I ever make that stupid decision to make him an acting ensign? That was the dumbest thing that any starship captain's ever done. Oh, well, I must have been out of my mind, but I've got to live with it now, blah, blah. And I'm just like, really? Like...
And and you're not reading this, but that's almost how it read.
Yeah, like that's how it sounded. Like, that wasn't the exact language used, but that's what the author, in my mind, was screaming to me reading that.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, that's a little... Now, Diane Carey is very well known as a huge fan of the original series, and maybe not quite as big a fan of the later series, as we said, most especially Enterprise. So I was wondering if that was a little bit of that kind of peeking through there. There were a couple other moments, but that was the one that really leapt out at me.
What I really liked is how she wrote his feelings about commanding this new galaxy class starship with families, that he felt that he is more of a governor of a colony than a captain of a starship, because now he's governing a society of families and these with children, and it's like a city in space. And the directive has been, especially in those early seasons, that the captain stays on the bridge, and when there's an away team mission, the first officer goes. So he starts to feel the regret of the old days of not having a regular starship anymore, but having this colony spaceship of families and this society basically on a starship where he is the governor, that he has to be protected. He's managing all of them and the operations. And when there's an away mission, he has to send his first officer to go do it. And he felt like it's playing it safe now, and he has to tend to the ship. And he looked at Riker as the barrier. Riker's doing what he wants to do, and Riker's in his way. And it's not because it's a personal problem with Riker. It's the role that Riker's in as first officer. Riker is the one that has to do the away missions. Riker's the one who basically gets to do all the fun, all the stuff Picard wants to do. And because that's Riker's job, and Riker's supposed to say to the captain, no, sir, I'll go do that. We need to protect you. He kind of resents Riker for that. And again, not personally, it's the role that he has to fulfill. It's what Starfleet has set up for him on a galaxy class starship like this. And I really liked how she really delved deeper into that. We got that on the series, but we really got into his head and how he was really viewing this as, I don't feel like a Starfleet captain anymore.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. And I wonder if that was maybe something in the series Bible too, that the series would explore more the idea of this city in space, and how, like, Picard worries when the ship rocks kind of thing. He's like, how many people just fell over, like civilians, and maybe hit their head, or you know what I mean? Like, he's worried about all the people on board. And it's something that early on in the Next Generation, they really talked a lot about and thought about. But in later episodes, like, for example, if you watch season 3's The Defector, and Picard takes his Galaxy-class starship with all of the hundreds of families on board and rockets into the Romulan neutral zone to find a Romulan colony or a Romulan outpost, supposedly building up to war, and take them on. And I'm like, okay, that's a moment that you would detach the saucer section and leave them in safety. And the show just kind of seemed to fall away from that idea and drop it. And like, if the families weren't important to the episode we're talking about, we're just going to kind of ignore that they're there. And Picard in that episode talks about the men and women under his command being willing to die for, what they're doing. And I always, when I watch that episode, and I love that episode, but when I watch that episode, I think, like, what about all the civilians on board that, like, are they standing up with their hands over their hearts saying, yeah, we're willing to die for all of this too? So it's really interesting. This book really takes that into account and really talks about it and what that means, and, what the future of the Federation is. My favorite part, I think, of the entire book was Picard thinking about that and talking about how future citizens of the Federation will be true citizens of the Federation living on these interstellar ships. You wouldn't say you're from Earth or you're from Vulcan. You would say, I'm from the Enterprise. And that's cool.
Right.
That's such a neat idea.
And what you were saying about the families in later seasons, there were times where I started to wonder, did the writers forget that there are families on this starship? And then all of a sudden there'd be an episode where you see a kid, and it's like, well, obviously they do remember. And it also reminds me of, like, Voyager. It's like all of a sudden, we have Starfleet and Maquis crew members. And after a while, that seemed to blur away. Like, do they even remember that they're Maquis? That they don't always get along? But it is interesting concept. I like that idea of I'm not from Earth, I'm not from Vulcan, I'm from the Enterprise. Yeah, and that's pretty cool. But let's talk about Riker, number one. So I didn't have a problem with the way his character was written. There were some parts maybe that seemed a little off. I had some other problems. And before I go into that, Dan, I'm just curious. What did you think of Riker?
Well, I had a few issues. I feel like his voice was a little closer to the Riker we know from the series. Like, just generally, when he's interacting with most of the crew, it felt more like Riker. But, there were definitely a few issues. I think the obvious one that everybody talks about when they talk about this book, of course, is something we've already brought up, which is his attitude towards Data and that sort of thing. One thing that I found was interesting about how his character is written here was we were talking about how Picard is envious of Riker and sees Riker as the person who's, in Picard's way of being a starship captain of old. Well, Riker's perspective is really interesting, where he sees himself when he's on the bridge as being useless, because he feels like he's just kind of hovering there and he's implementing the captain's orders, but he doesn't really have a station. He's just kind of there, to be a second captain or like the captain's right hand kind of thing. And I thought that was really interesting, kind of commenting on the role of the first officer and that sort of thing. I thought it was a really different perspective and one that I hadn't really thought of before. So, I did appreciate that a little bit.
Talking through this makes me appreciate the book more so than when I read it, because it really is showing that these characters are trying to find their place, and they're also trying to figure out how they relate, not just into their jobs, but with each other. And so it would make sense that he's questioning, what is this what I'm doing on the bridge? I kind of feel useless. And there were times he was, do I even want to, serve under this guy, this Picard guy? I'm not even that sure about him. And Picard's just like, I'm not even sure about this number one guy. Like they're still figuring things out. There's times people who've got to know me over time. Sometimes they'll say, when I first met you, I was, you were kind of quiet, but now it's like you talk all the time. Like you don't even seem like the same person when I first met you. I've gotten that comment every once in a blue moon. And so it's almost like that. It's like when we're first meeting these characters, they don't quite seem like we know them the way we do now, but because they're just kind of falling into place. They're a new family. They kind of have to work out those little kinks. Mm-hmm. And I can see why Riker would maybe be a little bit of a jerk about Data. I don't think it came across really bad. I think he was just, Data's a machine, isn't he? I mean, whatever, and I don't think he was a total jerk, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. I mean, do you think that way about him? It just didn't come across that way to me.
I think not intentionally a jerk, or
not as much as Pulaski was today.
Yeah, no, not intentionally a jerk, or not intentionally antagonistic, but maybe a little bit what would the word be? Unthinking. Just kind of like, oh, he's just a machine. He's like a tricorder. I don't have to take his feelings into account. I just, Data gets zapped on the bridge and, might possibly have died. And Riker's like, next time that happens, stay connected, because it's possible that this thing could communicate through you. And everyone else is like, don't you care? Or, well, Geordi in particular is like, don't you care that he almost died? And he's like, well, he's not alive. He's just a machine. Like, he's not being a jerk. He's just, doesn't take it into account that Data might have feelings. And we'll get to Data, and Data does seem to have feelings in this, which is an interesting take on his character as well.
I like how you said that Riker is not thinking. He's, unthinking about things. Mm-hmm. And because that comes up a few times in here, and Crusher takes Riker to task on that when it comes to Geordi. She's, at one point she lectures Riker. She brings him into sickbay and says, she crosses her arms and says, hey, the way you're talking to Geordi, he, you're telling him that he doesn't, like, I'm telling you, you don't listen to Geordi, is what she starts saying to Riker. You're not listening to him.
Mm-hmm.
You think, she says, quote, you think all he does is see, but you're not understanding what he has to go through and what that visor does, and that he's in pain. That, you can look at something and say, oh, this is green or whatever, but he has to kind of translate that. He doesn't see it quite the way you do. So for you to just expect him to look at something and give you a report on that isn't going to happen. He has to process it.
Mm-hmm.
He looks at it differently. And so this thing of Riker maybe not understanding Data and not understanding Geordi and whatever. Again, it's like you said, it's not like he's being a jerk. He's maybe just not thinking, or maybe he's not that familiar with them yet to really know what to think. But at the same time, this is where I started to really have a problem with the book. I felt everybody was being a little bit too unfair to Riker. I felt like, every time Riker would state something, they'd all kind of like, oh, seriously? Like, really? Like, you're going to go that direction? Like, there's one point where, and again, we'll get to this later, but there's a big decision. There's a big philosophical conversation going on. And it seems like the crew all of a sudden is on board with one way. And Riker's like, well, I'm not too sure about that. Maybe that's not the correct way to go. And they just look at him like, really? You're going to be that way? Come on, dude. And as a matter of fact, and I've got the book here, I'm opening it up on page 214, and it's the very first line on this page. So Data's off. He's in a shuttlecraft. He just leaves on his own, doesn't tell anybody, which we'll talk more, I guess, when we get to Data. But Geordi sees Riker and says, he took a shuttlecraft and headed out to find the creature. And it's your fault, sir. It was like that throughout the book, where people are just like calling him out. It's your fault.
Yeah, that scene in particular, Geordi just kind of keeps poking at Riker about this thing. And admittedly, he's angry and he thinks of Data as his friend and is mad at Riker. But he does go too far. Geordi is, I would say, insubordinate in that scene. And Riker kind of calls him on it. He's like, okay, Geordi, thank you. I get it, kind of thing. Like, I got it. Thank you. You can stop now. But, well, I mean, let's move on to Geordi then for this one, because I do have to say, I agree with you. People are unnecessarily harsh on Riker a little bit for this, for sure. And Geordi is the worst offender. And that scene in particular, I was doing the like roll my eyes away from the book, like, okay, we get it. Geordi in this novel is really interesting. I think the friendship between him and Data, again, this is all just guessing on my part, but that must be something that was outlined in the character Bible as well, because it's so reinforced here. And I think it's really interesting. And I love that they connect the fact that Geordi has a mechanical aspect to him through his visor for why he's able to empathize with Data a bit, and the stuff that he goes through with his visor, which I have to say, I think is the most honest and most interesting exploration of Geordi's quote unquote disability that we ever get in Star Trek, in or out of a novel, that I've read anyway. I feel like I'm like Riker. I didn't give it any thought as to how Geordi sees through his visor. It's just like, oh, he has a visor, so that shortcoming that he has is overcome. He can see now. It's different than the way we see, but he can see. And I love that the book took a lot of time to really kind of break down how the visor would work and how Geordi sees through it and what that means, and how he's kind of had to rewire his brain to be able to accommodate that. And again, it's something that I never thought of, and I thought was really, really thought-provoking when I read this book.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. It really got us to think about Geordi. And we're saying, Riker's not thinking, but you're right. We don't always think about what Geordi has to go through with the visor, what he is actually seeing. I mean, you can read tons of Star Trek novels and see episodes, and there's nothing that even touches upon how he sees things, which you don't need to do in every book. I mean, he has his way of doing, seeing things, and other people have a way of doing things and experiencing things, and you don't have to touch on that all the time. It's just part of his everyday life. But to actually take the moment to think, it's like Geordi, he can't just look at an apple. He's got to really learn to figure out what an apple looks like to him and what that means, and put all that data together in his head and figure it out. And over time, once he sees an apple more and more, he knows what it is, but it takes some learning. And so when he sees something new, he's got to process it differently. I mean, think about all the times the away teams go on a mission and you meet a new alien species. It's the first time we're seeing this alien race, but he's seeing something different. He's not seeing what we're seeing. And it's an interesting thing to really take in when next time you watch a episode of The Next Generation and they're seeing something new for the first time, take a moment and think, well, Geordi's not seeing that. He's seeing something different. And how's he processing that? I mean, I wonder if it's like, if Riker ever would say to Geordi, "Oh my gosh, Geordi, what a beautiful woman she is." And Geordi would be like, "Oh, that's not how I envisioned her."
Or, "Oh, that's a woman." Okay. Good to know. Make a mental note of that.
Speaking of that, that's a good segue to Yar. I want to touch on Yar because this is the thing I had a bit of a problem with. This is the problem I had. It's not a big deal, but there were several times that Diane Carey, every time she brought up Yar, and Yar's not in this book a lot, but every time she brought her up, she had to point out the fact that she looks like a little boy because of her haircut and her physique. What am I trying to say? Her physique. And it's just like, I don't know. It was just a little too much. And I thought, at the time, and we're talking 1987 when the show came out, I mean, that style of hair that Denise Crosby had, and almost kind of continues to have, but that short hairstyle back then wasn't that unusual for women. And it wasn't like short hair on women was an unusual thing in the 80s. I mean, Pat Benatar and so on and so forth. I mean, it was quite popular. So I thought it was really odd that she kept, she looks like a boy. And, well, the way she grew up and the experience she had when she was younger, she didn't really get to be feminine. And so that's the way she is now. And I don't know. I didn't like that. I just felt like it implied that, to be a woman, you have to be this way. And so since she's not this way, she comes across like a boy.
Yeah, it was a little grating for sure how that kept coming up. And it's like, okay. I mean, that is, we see that a little bit in episodes. Like I think Yar kind of says something similar in the second episode, The Naked Now, when she's talking to Troy, "You wear such beautiful clothes. I never get to be feminine, blah, blah, blah." And I'm just like, okay. Like, it's just, it's a little weird. The thing that I noticed about Yar, and I'm going to kind of group Worf in here as well, how Picard always kept referring to them as his two hotheads who are always flying off the handle at the slightest provocation. And they're so angry all the time and so full of aggression. And it seemed odd to me because, I mean, Yar, in her role as chief of security, advocates for an aggressive stance a lot and that sort of thing, but never really thought of her as a hothead. I don't know. Did you ever really picture her that way?
No, not really. No. But again, I think it's what you touched on before. I think Diane Carey is working a lot from the series Bible. But then at the same time, I would think that other authors that we've read first original novels on were working in that same situation. But I also feel that, I mean, when we talk about, the original series, it had been on a while by the time the novel we reviewed, The Entropy Effect. But when it comes to Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and then Enterprise, I think they knew how to make a series, I guess is what I'm saying. Like, The Next Generation was the first of the new series of starting over again. And they wrote a Bible, and it took them a while to kind of figure things out and make it work. And, people, usually talk about the first 2 seasons were just kind of getting their feet wet. And by the time you got to the 3rd season, they've kind of figured things out. And I think because they figured things out with The Next Generation, they figured out how to start off another series with Deep Space Nine and Voyager and Enterprise, and probably kept closer to those series Bibles than they did with The Next Generation. So if she's working from the Bible, it may feel a little, series Bible, not the Bible. Come on, people. No, but, she's working from the series Bible, then it may feel a little off because they kind of changed things. So they didn't keep Yar, or they didn't go with Yar as being a hothead. And Worf in this book didn't feel off to me at all.
Yeah, Worf actually, I think, was spot on, which is interesting because I feel like he had very little that was kind of known or said about his character throughout the whole first season of The Next Generation, with maybe like 1 episode of an exception kind of thing. So I thought that was really interesting that voice seemed so genuine, which is interesting. And I'm really glad you brought up what you did, because that's something I wanted to mention is I think Diane Carey had a very difficult task with this novel. Again, not just not knowing the characters, but really not being familiar with the language of 24th century Star Trek. Because, I was kind of thinking as I was reading this, if you take these same conversations and thoughts and put it in an original series setting, it feels more natural. Like I could see Bones being a little bit more quick to fly off the handle at certain things, and people maybe making their opinions known a little bit louder than
like, Captain, I'm giving her everything she's got, and they're expressing themselves more in the original series.
Yeah, exactly. So it's exactly like you said, this was the first time they'd done another Star Trek besides the original series, and it has a very specific language, a very specific tone that in a lot of ways is carried on through Deep Space Nine and Voyager. Different permutations, but kind of that same feeling, that same 24th century Star Trek feeling, that because Diane Carey came first and supposedly, again, based on what I've heard, hadn't even seen the show and was just working from those pre-production materials, really had, this Herculean task to knock out this story and put those characters in those situations and make them sound even somewhat like they might actually be on the screen.
Yeah. And I think, and we've done all the first originals at this point, except for maybe Enterprise. Is that right, Dan? I can't remember.
No, we did Enterprise. That was by the book.
Did we do? By the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we did do that. So this is the last of them. We've done all the others.
We actually do have one more.
Or is it Deep Space Nine? I can't remember.
We did Deep Space Nine, we did Voyager, we did Enterprise, we did the original series, we did The Next Generation, but we actually still have Star Trek Discovery's first original novel to do, which is really exciting. So
yes,
September 24th, we get the series. So hopefully we should get an announcement of when that first novel will be coming too. So
yeah, and I think probably about a month after that or something. I don't think it'll be the day it premieres, but shortly after. Yeah,
that'd be my guess.
Yeah. So let's hit real quick because we're kind of running out of time here. So these other characters, Crusher, I thought she was pretty on target, but she was a little more snappy with Picard than usual, in my opinion. A little more of like, I'm getting to that, Jean-Luc. He kept like, okay, get on with it. I'm getting there. Trust me. Hey, let me get this out. Let me tell you what's going on.
Yeah, Crusher was good. I think Crusher was one of the better ones that I was most recognizable anyway, to be.
Yeah, and I don't think Troy was too far off either, but a lot of the book she was going through a challenge with these entities kind of in her head, so she wasn't herself for most of the book anyway.
Yeah, there were some bits of her characterization. I think I feel like her character changed a lot between Encounter at Farpoint and the rest of the series, because if you watch Encounter at Farpoint, whenever she's reading someone else's emotions, it's like she's feeling them at the same time too. I feel great pain and, great joy and happiness. And then like later on, she just reports on it. She doesn't necessarily live through it. And I feel like this book was more like she was living through it at the same time. So a lot of the time she was kind of, just overcome with sorrow or overcome with pain and all this kind of stuff, which, if you're a psychologist working on a ship full of people, that's going to be very debilitating and a huge hindrance to doing your job, I would say. So glad they kind of did away with that.
Yeah, that Encounter of Farpoint Troy is a little much.
A little bit, yeah.
I like just to assume that she was nervous. It was her first, mission on the starship, and she hit the bottle a little one too many or something, and just I'm really feeling the emotions on this mission.
The bridge crew of the Enterprise D, the untold story. Behind the L-cars. I don't know, something like that.
And Picard's like, we may have a problem with this one. Maybe we need to get a really good, wise bartender on the ship. I need to call Guinan.
Ooh, too close to home.
Well, the last character of our crew is Wesley. And there wasn't a whole lot of Wesley in here, but I do like how they touched upon... because it was like one of these things where it was like, hey, Wesley, you're the one who's going to try to rescue the ship. We had one of those moments in here. He's going to rescue the ship. But they were pointing out the fact that, he is this prodigy, that there's something special about him, that he's not like any other kid. So I like that they went there, because I think one of the things that maybe people didn't pick up on the first season or so of The Next Generation is there's something different about Wesley. He's just not a typical teenage kid that any teenage kid can rescue the ship and the crew is a bunch of idiots. That there's something more about him. He is some prodigy. He's almost like some next Einstein or something of that time.
Yeah, which I thought was great, but at the same time I'm also really glad that they had him mess up a little bit, which I feel like they didn't do really much in The Next Generation. I guess, with a few notable exceptions, but I liked that they comment on, he's a genius, he's a prodigy, but at the same time, there's some things he just doesn't think about because he doesn't have the experience and that kind of thing, which I thought was a really good balanced take on his character for sure.
Yeah. Well, I think that was a really good summary of the characters. I think we hit it pretty good.
We didn't talk a lot about Data. Which...
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. We forgot about Data, yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. We're just a bunch of Rikers. We don't really think about Data.
Well, because he's a machine.
Yeah, exactly. It's not a character. I mean, come on.
Right.
No, actually, Data is another one that I think was really done interestingly in this book. There's a line in a recent Star Trek novel where they talk about how Data, before he had the emotion chip, didn't have human emotions, but he did have android emotions. And if you watch The Next Generation, there are moments where you can't say Data doesn't totally have emotions because, he's showing something there kind of thing. And I think this book kind of had that a little bit where, he has kind of this basic level of emotion and seems like he's hurt at times with certain words and that sort of thing, which I thought that was an interesting take. Besides that little difference, I think Diane Carey did a really good job with his character, and I think that would have been probably one of the more difficult ones to write.
Yeah, again, I didn't feel like he was off. He felt like Data to me, and especially first season Data.
Yeah.
Like you're saying, with that kind of emotion, like he's figuring things out, which is one of the reasons he goes off on a shuttlecraft, and it's all Riker's fault. Well, because also, it was interesting because the creature, and so this will go into the next part that we want to talk about, the creature has absorbed these, the humans from the Soviet ship that we talked about earlier, and I guess maybe some other beings from other places. And Data's really using this as an opportunity as well, if the creature is looking to absorb the soul, the essence of living beings, if it takes from me, then I know I'm actually living. If it doesn't take from me, then I am just machine.
Mm-hmm.
And I really liked that play in there. And I don't even know if he really got his answer without giving too much away.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's a little ambiguous at the end, which I feel like is probably on purpose, because you don't really want to answer one of what I think is one of the central questions of the entire Next Generation series. You don't really want to answer that in the first novel that isn't even an episode kind of thing. So I feel like it's an interesting step. If you take this as part of the history of the character, it's an interesting step in his journey to discover his humanity, you know, to use all the cliches that they use in the Next Generation for Data's journey kind of thing. But yeah, it's an interesting question. I think the actions he took were a little drastic. I don't know that was in Data's character, but yeah, it's dramatic. It works. It was interesting for sure.
Yeah, that was maybe a little off character, but it was interesting. It was something I wanted to see play out. But at the same time, what we learn from this creature is that Troy is sensing and hearing these souls. And I keep saying souls because they're physically not there. The people from the Soviet ship aren't within the creature physically. They're mentally there. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like the souls of themselves have been trapped in this creature for several hundred years. And they're making a plea to Troy that, you know, we're immortal, but we have no life. We can't do anything. We're just here within this creature. We're just existing, mm-hmm. but we have no purpose, and we have no will to do things on our own. And we want to end this. We want an end to our lives, mm-hmm. because we don't feel like we have a life now. And so they're reaching out to her and saying, we want you to kill us. Now, the question comes up then from the crew, do we kill them? I mean, because that's not the Starfleet way of doing things. You don't kill life. You don't kill innocent beings. They're not in pain. And this is where Dr. Crusher goes on a big, long speech from a medical standpoint of things. You know, you can have a patient that is in severe pain and maybe is dying, and maybe you pull the plug at that moment, but these people aren't in pain. Mm-hmm. It's just they just have the will not to live anymore. So then the concept of suicide comes up. Well, that's what people who commit suicide are people that, you know, they may not be in physical pain. Some are, some aren't, mm-hmm. but they're just unhappy and they want it to end. And, you know, you're not going to support suicide. At least I hope not. And I mean, so a lot of these questions really start coming up in the book. I'm trying to see here. It looks like it's, if anybody has the book and wants to go back and just kind of see the section I'm talking about, this would be chapter 8, and there's 13 chapters in the book, so it's about, you know, like 2/3 of the way through or so. There's a lot of things that come up. I don't want to go too deep into this. Mm-hmm. It's kind of a negative thing because we're talking about life and death and when you give up life. And again, this is one of those things where they basically are making the decision like they should probably go ahead and fulfill their wishes and kill them. And that's when Riker's like, well, I don't know if we should. We don't take life. And they're like, what? What's wrong with you?
Well, so, I mean, Picard makes what I think is the only logical decision you can make in that situation, and that's to get into a sensory deprivation tank, I guess.
Yeah, that was a little
that
weird.
was really weird. I'm like, okay, so you're in the middle of this crisis, and it's like, you know what, I'm going to get, and he even says while he's in there, it's like, well, Riker did say I should relax a bit too, so okay. Just like, really? But, what it does do is serve to show Picard what that sort of experience would be like. So he's basically paralyzed. He can't feel his body at all. If he could feel his body enough to even develop an itch on his face, he couldn't scratch it. Like he couldn't move, but he's not even aware enough to be able to feel his face. He's totally conscious, but totally weightless in the middle of this space and not able to feel any part of his body. So, of course, after a few hours, he's freaking out. He's panicking because he's alone with his thoughts, and he's relived all the good memories, and now he's starting in on the negative ones, and he comes to realize that it is kind of a personal hell, that kind of situation. So, that it's ostensibly to help him aid him in making this decision. Should I destroy this and end these people's suffering, or allow them or force them to carry on as they are, kind of thing. So it's interesting. I just think like you could have arrived at that decision a different way. It seemed weird to jump in a sensory deprivation tank in the middle of everything that was going on.
And I didn't feel that it really helped him out that much on the decision.
Yeah, it didn't really get referred to afterwards. Like, he obviously had kind of a horrific experience, and he does decide to, we're spoiling the book, of course, but he does decide to carry out the wishes of the people on the ghost ship. But he doesn't really refer back to why he made that decision or what about that experience made him make that decision. So it seemed odd that, it was a big part of the book, but it doesn't seem to carry any weight going forward. Or if it does, we're not told in what way it did.
And this is going back to what we were talking earlier about Data, of did he really find that his answer? We never really got an answer to that. It's almost like there's these two concepts going on, but I don't feel like we really got the answer or the resolution to those events.
Yeah. It's a little bit unsatisfying, maybe. Like you feel like maybe not having everything wrapped up in a nice little bow, but it'd be nice if we got some sort of indication from Picard, like what role that experience played in his decision, or what Data took away from that experience at the end. Like, we know what happened, but we don't really know how Data feels about it or what he thinks now based on that experience. And it would be nice to kind of at least get that little bit of a coda to find that out.
Overall, I mean, do you have any other comments about the book? I was just thinking we'd just kind of go into our last thoughts on it.
I agree. I think we've teased this one apart pretty thoroughly.
Well, sometimes it helps for me to talk about a book. I can read a book and go, oh yeah, that was pretty good. And then when I sit here and talk to somebody about it and go through it, sometimes I appreciate the book even more. And I would say that's kind of the case with this.
Therapeutic podcasting. I like it.
Exactly. I'm laying on the couch right now as we're doing this, like I'm in a psych office. But, I would say I was leaning towards like a 3 out of 5 stars type situation, but I'm going to bump it up by another half star and say more like 3.5. I think the characters were a little off for the reasons we discussed earlier, and I don't feel that that's any fault of the author. I think just like the show, it's trying to find its place, not just in starting a new series, but really starting anew with the whole franchise at that time. And I could tell she was probably really working a lot with that series Bible, as you were pointing out, Dan. But the concept of the story was interesting, and I liked what she was doing with Data, that his exploration of himself. So, I mean, it's just in a historic way in Star Trek. I almost feel like it's something you want to pick up and read as a Star Trek fan, just to see, what was the thought process of the Next Generation in the early days. And I think this kind of shows that. And So it's an interesting read from that standpoint also, not just from a story standpoint, but just, where was their thought and thinking of the characters in the series at that time? And I mean, it is well written. So, again, I'd give it 3.5 out of 5, and it's 258 pages. So it's, fairly quick read. It's not a really long book. And so, yeah, I say if you're a Star Trek fan and especially of the Next Generation, I think it's worth checking out sometime.
Yeah, I think I would agree mostly with what you said there. Star Trek history is kind of filled with these roads not taken or alternate takes or early versions. And I mean, maybe this veers a little bit from what we know of what became of the Next Generation, but Gold Key Comics, this ain't. Like, it's not that big a diversion. The characters are a little bit off. Brandon Shamatala was actually supposed to join us for this podcast. He wasn't able to make it, but he did have a couple of points that I kind of wanted to share. And I think, his views kind of line up a lot with ours. He thought the book was very good, but it missed the characters the most. And again, for a lot of the reasons that we've already discussed. One thing that I thought was interesting is he mentioned it made him think of the bickering Bickleys from the early TNG comics, and he wondered why everyone was yelling.
Right.
And I think that kind of feeds into what we were saying about Picard and his harshness, and the Next Generation. And again, this goes back to what we were saying, the language of 24th century Star Trek. That was one of the mandates handed down by Gene Roddenberry, was that the crew members don't get into fights with each other. There's not a lot of conflict among the characters, and this book definitely had more conflict between the characters than we are used to in the Next Generation. So I think that makes it tonally a little different than what we're used to, but if you kind of take that into account, it's a really interesting story. I wish there'd been a little bit more of a wrap up to it. Like we said, some of the main points of the book kind of feel a little bit unfinished. But at the same time, it's a very interesting Star Trek story with maybe, as Brandon says, a few too many exclamation points in it. But and it's interesting that you said that this discussion bumped your score up, because I feel like it did the same for me. And I feel like I was a little bit harsher than you. I came into this wanting to give it 2 out of 5 stars. And it's actually bumped up to a 3 out of 5 stars for me because of a lot of the things that we talked about. Data's experiences, being able to talk with you about what he goes through and what all of the characters kind of go through made me appreciate this book a little bit more. So, therapeutic podcasting, I think that's a really good term that we might have to adopt, because, reading a book in isolation is fun. I read lots of books that aren't just Star Trek books, but being able to talk about it, or even just listen to a podcast about it, like our listeners are doing right now, is a really interesting way to kind of coalesce your thoughts on a book. So, if we can be therapeutic podcasting for any Star Trek readers out there, that's great. That's really cool. So yeah, I would give this one an updated 3 out of 5 sensory deprivation tanks, because why not?
Why not? I mean, Picard feels the same way. Therapeutic podcasting.
Well, I think we're pretty much on the same page with Ghost Ship. It was a product of its time. It's a little bit of a different take on the Next Generation. Not necessarily a bad take, but very clearly not the direction that the series went in. But at the same time, an interesting story that I think we both got a lot out of.
Yeah, I did get a lot out of this, and I'm almost curious to go back and read some of the other earlier Next Generation novels and see how much it fits into this, and the style of writing and of the characters, or how they develop over time. It starts to fit in with what we see later in the series. And one thing I want to point out that I did like about the book that we forgot to mention is, in some of the early novels, and I think the scripts, Troy refers to Riker as Bill.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's Tasha that asks, why do you call him Bill and everybody else calls him Will? And she says something about, well, Bill reminds her of a Betazoid word that means, I think it was shaving.
Shaving cream, yeah.
Shaving cream,
Yeah.
right. Which I think is funny because he later develops a beard and she stops calling him Bill.
Yeah, I thought of that too. I thought that was hilarious. Like a little bit of unintended kind of coincidence there. It's really cool.
Yeah. So I thought that was pretty funny. So, but that was good discussion. Again, it's one of these things that was like, I don't even know. I don't know how much we're going to get into this, but we went in pretty far into this book. We took a lot of time on that, but it's been fun talking about it. But of course, it's not the only thing we're discussing here on the Trek FM network. So here's a quick look at some of the other things you may have missed elsewhere on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, The Orb.
When Lieutenant Saru says, I sense the coming of death. They could be playing Staying Alive in the background.
They're like, whatever, man. BG say I'm staying
We're
alive.
staying alive. Aren't you listening to the sound system on this bridge?
Man, your bell-bottoms too tight, boy.
That would be awesome if they had bell bottoms on the Discovery uniforms.
Meta Treks.
Garrick really personifies that snake-like way of kind of slithering around in the shadows, more subtle than any other character in the Star Trek universe.
Plain simple Garrick would be the first to say that the clothes make the Cardassian.
Primitive Culture. A look at history and culture through Star Trek.
This episode was actually banned by the BBC for many years, and they always said, I don't know if this is true, not so much because of the kind of allegorical significance of the episode, but because of this single line in it where Data says, he basically says, oh, well, the IRA basically achieved what they wanted in, I think it's 2024.
2024, yeah.
Is coming up.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
So check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favorite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. And you'll find us wherever you find your podcasts.
If you're an Apple user, please be sure to hit that subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published. Hitting that subscribe button not only means that you get the podcasts as soon as they're up, but it helps other people find us if they're looking for Star Trek book podcasts. And another thing that helps in that direction is leaving us a star rating and a written review. We really want to hear what you think of all the shows and Literary Treks in particular. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and most other third-party apps. And you can also stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link there as well.
If you'd like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron on the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more. Available through our special Patreon's website, Patreon Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, and we really appreciate any support you can give us and hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/TrekFM.
We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place to join the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook, and that's for all the shows on the Trek FM network. Just type Babel, that's Babel, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select Literary Treks, and that'll come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM.
Find us on our Goodreads group where we have bookshelves with all of our previously covered books, as well as our current reading section that shows you what's coming up for future shows. So check that out. We have great conversations in the group. I just put a poll up there recently, which I'll tell you real quick. We had, at the point of this recording, 34 votes, and the question was, how many Star Trek books do you usually read in a month? And 41% said that it varies. Sometimes they read one, sometimes none in a month. But the majority of people read in our group at least one Star Trek book each month. We had 32.4% say they read 1 to 2 a month, and 26.5% say they read 3 to 4. So a lot of people reading Star Trek books. So join us in the Goodreads group. Just search for Literary Treks in the search field on Goodreads and click Join Group. And we'd like to thank Ken Tripp, Greg Rosier, and Brandon Shea Matala for their support of the Trek FM network and being associate producers for Literary Treks as well. Now, Dan, when you're not yelling at Riker and telling him that everything is his fault, where can people find you?
Darn Riker, he's just in the way. I just want him beamed down and lead an away team. Good Lord. Well, I'll be, you can find me on facebook.com/Kertrats Productions. That's Kertrats. I'm also on YouTube at youtube.com/Kertrats Productions. I'm on Twitter at Kertrats. That's Kertrats, which I've already said. And you can also find me on Instagram at Kertrats47, where I'm not taking pictures of alien vistas because, again, that jerk just won't let me beam down. Now, Bruce, when you're not stealing a shuttlecraft to see if you actually have a soul, where can we find you?
I'm a soul man. I'm a soul man. And you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Admiral_Rex on Twitter. And you can also find me on the Star Wars Report podcast talking about Star Wars, of course, with Riley Blanton and Mark Herleman. And, of course, you can always find me in the Babel Conference on Facebook. Well, that being said, thanks everyone for listening. And until next time,
live long
and read on.
What do you call that, light reading? To each his own, number one.